Hello, friends, and welcome back to Stories About Entitled People. Today's story is a reminder that buildings don't run on ego, and neither do background checks. One man's meltdown over office furniture exposed a lie big enough to end his career on the spot. But before we begin, best way to support our channel is to leave comments, like, and subscribe with the turned-on bell so you don't miss the new video every single day. Here we go. His ego over a desk triggered an HR review. His resume didn't survive it. This happened at work last year, and I still think about it whenever someone starts throwing their job title around like it's a badge of nobility. I work for a large tech company as a building maintenance technician. My job is pretty straightforward: repairs, coordinating contractors, moving office furniture, fixing things people don't even realize are broken until they suddenly are. I don't write code, I don't attend vision alignment meetings. I make the building actually function. Most of the people I work around are engineers and developers. Some of them are great, normal, grounded people who treat everyone with respect. Others not so much. If you let their job title inflate their ego until they forget that the office doesn't magically clean itself or rearrange furniture through sheer innovation. Then there was this guy. We had an exceptionally nice desk sitting in an empty office. I'm talking expensive, custom, solid wood, probably cost more than my car nice. It wasn't just sitting there randomly. The desk was reserved for one of the company's senior executives, a bigwig who was out of town for a couple of months. We were holding on to it until she came back so she could decide what she wanted removed or rearranged to make room for it in her office. While it was in storage, a new hire engineer, very junior, very low on the ladder, decided to move into the empty office. He asked permission, and his supervisor gave him a temporary okay with one very clear condition. The desk was not his. It was not permanent, and we'd be coming to retrieve it at some point. He was explicitly told not to get comfortable. Apparently, he did not hear that last part. Fast forward a few weeks, and we finally get the call to move the desk. My team heads over with dollies and tools, ready to do what we were paid to do. As soon as we started clearing around the desk, the engineer storms into the room like we just insulted his bloodline. "What are you doing?" he snaps. "We're here for the desk," one of my coworkers says calmly. "It's being moved." His face immediately turns red. "You can't take that. That's my desk." I explained politely that it was never his desk, that it belonged to an executive, that he'd been warned it was temporary. That did absolutely nothing to calm him down. "I'm an engineer," he shouts. "I deserve this desk. Do you know how important my work is? You can't just walk in here and take it." This is the critical mistake. He didn't just want the desk. He believed the desk was a physical manifestation of his fabricated status. His identity was so flimsy that its validation depended on a piece of furniture he'd only borrowed. Taking the desk wasn't an inconvenience, it was an existential threat. We all kind of looked at each other. No one raised their voice, no one argued. We just kept doing our job. That only made him angrier. He followed us out into the hallway, continuing to rant about respect, status, and how people like us shouldn't touch his things. When we didn't engage, he redirected his fury toward the front desk employee who had absolutely nothing to do with any of it. He started yelling at him about authorization, access, and how the desk removal was unacceptable. Unfortunately for him, the front desk guy is not the kind of person who tolerates being screamed at. Within minutes, the engineer's supervisor and HR were involved. The whole thing escalated quickly because once HR gets pulled in over a workplace outburst, they don't just look at the outburst, they look at everything. The tantrum was the tripwire. By creating a formal HR incident, he shifted the scrutiny from a piece of furniture to his own conduct and, by inevitable extension, his credentials. He thought he was defending his territory. He was actually demanding an audit of his own legitimacy. That's when things got interesting. During the investigation, someone noticed inconsistencies in his background, degrees that didn't quite line up, experience that was vaguely described but never substantiated, certifications that sounded impressive but weren't verifiable. A deeper review of his resume followed. Turns out he lied. Not exaggerated, flat-out fabricated qualifications. He didn't have the education required for the position. He wasn't remotely qualified for the role he'd been hired into. Somehow he'd slipped past the initial hiring process, and no one had taken a hard enough look until he decided to throw a tantrum over a desk that was never his. By the end of the week, he was gone. Badge deactivated, access revoked, deskless. The irony was almost poetic. He'd managed to fake his way into a high-paying tech job, probably could have coasted for a while if he kept his head down, and instead blew it all up because he felt entitled to a piece of furniture that didn't belong to him. The perfect paradox: his entire fraud was built on appearing legitimate, but the ego required to maintain that fraud couldn't tolerate the smallest perceived slight. The desk was the symbol he couldn't relinquish, and in clinging to it, he shattered the entire illusion. The most secure lies are often undone by the most insecure egos. That desk, it went exactly where it was always supposed to go. The executive loved it, never once asked who'd been using it before, and every time I pass that office now, I can't help but smile a little, knowing that sometimes all it takes to expose someone full of hot air is a few wheels, a dolly, and a refusal to indulge their ego. And our next story. They tried to foreclose on a house. Our lawyer informed them they were trespassing on our land. In 1973, my parents were not rich people. They were careful people. Careful with money, careful with promises, careful with plans. They'd saved long enough to put together a modest down payment and finally felt confident enough to build a small ranch house out in the country. Nothing fancy, one floor, a simple layout, enough space for 2 adults and the kids they were already wrangling. The kind of house people built when they planned to stay put. They went to the small local bank in town, the kind with tellers who knew your name and loan officers who went to church with your neighbors. The mortgage was approved without much fuss, and the bank signed a contract with a local builder named Bob. Bob was supposed to receive the funds in stages as the house was built, according to plans that had already been drawn up and approved. Bob, unfortunately, turned out to be one of those people who was very good at getting contracts and very bad at honoring them. What my parents didn't realize at first was that Bob was building everyone's house at the same time, or at least trying to. He had projects scattered all over town and seemed to believe that as long as something vaguely resembling progress was happening somewhere, everything would eventually sort itself out. Bob himself was rarely present. Instead, he sent crews of workers who clearly had never met each other, the plans, or basic construction standards. The build immediately started dragging, deadlines slipped, work had to be redone, then redone again and again. This wasn't cosmetic stuff. It wasn't, oh, we used the wrong cabinet handles, or the paint color looks a little off in this light. This was fundamental structural incompetence. At one point, the architect hadn't fully erased a line from the blueprints, and the framing crew interpreted it literally. They built a wall straight through the space where the bathtub was supposed to go. Not near it, not partially blocking it, directly through it. Another time, my mother was warned, very seriously, not to put anything heavy in the kitchen cabinets once they were installed. When she asked why, she was told the cabinets weren't attached to the studs, they were attached to drywall using a handful of roofing nails through the cabinet backs. Apparently, this was considered acceptable by someone involved in the process. The garage framing was even worse. Instead of opening toward the driveway, the garage door opening had been framed facing the living room. This wasn't a design choice. This was a complete failure to understand orientation. When questioned, one of Bob's workers shrugged and said something along the lines of, "That's how the plan looked to me." Bob, for his part, was nowhere to be found. As the months dragged on, the situation at home got worse. My mother was a stay-at-home mom with 2 very small children, stuck in a rental that had become increasingly unpleasant. The landlord was hostile, the space was cramped, and the promise of just a little longer stretched on endlessly. My father was working 2 jobs, coming home exhausted, dealing with phone calls from the bank and Bob that never quite lined up with reality. Instead of help, my parents were met with pressure. The bank grew impatient, Bob grew defensive, my mother was talked down to, my father was lied to. What should have been an exciting, hopeful chapter in their lives turned into a constant source of stress. My mom cried more than she likes to admit. My dad withdrew and got quiet in a way that scared her. Eventually, the bank sent a representative for the final inspection. My parents met him outside and told him flatly they would not be signing off on the house. The representative did not take this well. He argued, he insisted, he reminded them how much money had already been paid out. Then, in a moment my father never forgot, the man marched up to the front door, grabbed the doorknob, and pulled. The entire door, frame and casing included, fell off the house and landed on him. It hadn't been nailed in. It had been wedged into place. Silence followed. The bank finally called Bob. Bob finally showed up. And somehow that made everything worse. This is the moment the abstract shoddy work becomes a physical, undeniable joke. The door falling off isn't just a defect. It's a perfect metaphor for the whole project. A facade of functionality that collapses at the slightest pressure, revealing the hollow, unstable reality beneath. Bob arrived on site with a lot of noise and very little substance. He talked fast, waved his arms, and acted deeply offended that anyone would dare question his work. He blamed his crews. He blamed the architect. He blamed supply delays. At one point, he implied that my parents were being too picky for first-time homeowners. The implication was clear. They should be grateful they were getting anything at all. My parents were not impressed. Bob promised to personally supervise the remaining work. That supervision consisted mostly of him standing around making calls and occasionally pointing at things that were already wrong. When issues were brought to his attention, he would sigh heavily and say things like, "That's not ideal, but it's within tolerance," or "That's how we've always done it." Nothing improved. The bank, meanwhile, grew increasingly hostile. They'd already paid Bob a significant portion of the construction money, and they wanted this problem to disappear. Their representative started pressuring my parents to sign off as is, assuring them that minor issues could be fixed later. When my parents refused, the tone changed. Calls became shorter, letters became colder. The word foreclosure was used more than once. Bob escalated too. He began threatening legal action for breach of contract, claiming my parents were refusing to cooperate and preventing him from finishing the job. This was rich, considering the house was borderline uninhabitable and actively dangerous in places, but Bob was confident. He had lawyers, he had relationships, he'd already spent money. My parents had very little. This is the standard playbook for the incompetent but entrenched: gaslight, delay, and threaten. They bank on their victims' exhaustion and fear of even greater loss. Bob and the bank weren't acting in good faith. They were performing a well-rehearsed dance to force acceptance of a catastrophic product. At that point, they were exhausted, emotionally, physically, financially. They'd put everything they had into this house. If it turned into a drawn-out legal battle, they knew they'd lose. Even if they were technically right, they didn't have the money to survive months or years of litigation against a bank and a contractor. So they went to see an attorney. His name was Tom. Tom was not flashy. He didn't have a booming voice or dramatic gestures. He listened quietly while my parents laid everything out: the construction issues, the threats, the fear of foreclosure. He asked for documents. He spread the paperwork across his desk and went through it slowly. My dad later said he could tell just from Tom's face that this wasn't going well. Then something changed. Tom stopped flipping pages. He leaned back and smiled. Not a big smile, not a smug smile, just a small, thoughtful one. The kind that makes you nervous if you're on the wrong side of the table. "Let's get everyone together," he said calmly, "tomorrow." The pivot. The attorney's smile isn't about finding a loophole. It's about recognizing a fundamental, catastrophic error in the other side's paperwork. While everyone was focused on the quality of the house, he was looking at the foundation of the deal itself. The calm is the confidence of someone who just found the keystone in the arch of their opponent's argument. The next day, my parents found themselves sitting in a conference room at the bank. Around the table were Tom, the bank's representative, the bank's attorney, Bob, and Bob's attorney. It was crowded. It was tense. Everyone expected an argument. Everyone expected negotiations. Tom didn't give them the chance. "Well," he said, folding his hands neatly on the table, "my clients have decided they no longer want this house." There was a pause. Then laughter. Actual laughter. Bob's attorney scoffed. The bank's representative shook his head. Someone asked if Tom was serious. Another asked if he understood how mortgages worked. The implication was that my parents were naive, emotional, and about to make a very expensive mistake. Tom waited for the laughter to die down. Then, without a word, he reached into his briefcase and placed a document on the table. It was the deed. "My clients own the land outright," Tom said evenly. "They no longer want the house. Please remove it." The room went quiet. Bob's attorney leaned forward first, picked up the deed, and read it carefully. His expression changed almost immediately. He looked up at Bob, then he looked back down at the paper, then back at Bob again. "You built a house," he said slowly, "on land you don't own?" Bob didn't answer right away. Then he nodded. The bank's attorney turned sharply toward the bank's representative. "You didn't finance the land?" he demanded. The representative stammered, "No." Tom folded his hands again. "As I said," he continued, calm as ever, "you are trespassing on my client's land. I expect the structure to be removed and the property returned to its original state immediately." No one laughed this time. Checkmate with a single piece of paper, the entire power dynamic inverted. They weren't in a meeting about construction defects anymore. They were in a meeting about trespassing and unauthorized improvement of real property. Tom didn't argue their case. He changed the game entirely, making their problem, the house, someone else's liability. My dad said the silence that followed was unforgettable. Not dramatic silence, not angry silence. The kind of silence where everyone in the room is doing frantic math in their head and realizing all the numbers come out very, very bad. The bank could technically foreclose, sure, but foreclose on what exactly? A half-finished, badly built house sitting on land they did not own and had never financed? They couldn't sell the land. They couldn't move the house. And if that structure was torn down, as Tom had very clearly requested, they'd be left with nothing but paperwork and a loss they couldn't explain to anyone higher up the chain. Bob was in even worse shape. He'd already paid roughly half the build costs out of pocket, expecting reimbursement when the bank released the final funds. If the house was removed, he wouldn't just lose that money, he'd be responsible for demolishing it, hauling it away, and restoring the land. On top of that, the bank would absolutely come after him for the money they had already given him. His entire business model relied on momentum and trust. This would destroy both. Could they have gone after my parents anyway? Yes, technically. They could have dragged things out, damaged my parents' credit, maybe even kept their down payment. But here was the problem. To sign off on that house as it stood would have required tens of thousands of dollars in immediate repairs just to make it safe. Roof, framing, electrical, plumbing, everything. The bank knew my parents didn't have that kind of money. They were the ones who approved the mortgage in the first place. This wasn't leverage, this was checkmate. The tone of the meeting changed almost immediately. Voices softened, apologies appeared. Suddenly everyone was very concerned about my parents' stress, their living situation, how unfortunate this whole misunderstanding had been. Bob started talking about how difficult it was to manage so many projects at once. The bank's representative began referring to my parents as valued customers. It was remarkable. Within days, real crews showed up, competent ones. Walls were torn out and rebuilt correctly. Cabinets were reinstalled into studs. Electrical and plumbing were redone to code. The garage door was reframed where it was actually supposed to go. Everything was brought back in line with the original blueprints and specifications at no additional cost to my parents. Bob supervised personally this time, and it showed. He didn't argue, he didn't posture. He just made sure things were done right, because now he had no other choice. My parents inspected everything carefully, and this time there was nothing to refuse. They signed the mortgage. Bob received the remaining funds, though my dad always suspected he barely broke even once all the corrections were accounted for. The bank quietly removed their representative from his position not long after. No announcement, no explanation, just gone. And Tom became a legend in our family. My dad said he still remembers walking out of that bank, the sun feeling brighter than it had in months, the stress lifted, the fear gone. What should have been one of the happiest times in my parents' lives had nearly been destroyed by incompetence and arrogance. But in the end, it became a story of someone knowing the law, reading the paperwork, and using it perfectly. The house still stands today. Solid, correct, safe. And every time my parents walk through the front door, they remember the day a lawyer calmly told a room full of powerful people to remove a house they didn't own. And meant it. The ultimate lesson isn't about legal trickery, it's about the power of foundational ownership. While everyone was distracted by the broken house, your parents held the unsaleable asset, the land. Tom's genius was ignoring the noisy, expensive problem everyone was fighting over and quietly enforcing the one simple, immovable fact that rendered all their threats and bluster meaningless. Hey guys, thank you all for watching the video. I'll see you in the next one.